2-minute countdown.
Oh, yeah. Said. Okay.
Okay. So it will start live streaming instantly after the countdown, yeah?
So it's up.
It's on.
Okay. So it will start live.
So Benny will start first, right?
I'll introduce everyone first.
Yeah.
Right. Looks like we're streaming. So, hello and welcome to everyone joining us. My name is Narayan Liu and I'll be serving as moderator for this discussion hosted by Stöd Hong Kong's Demokrati here in Sweden. We'll be discussing the ongoing Hong Kong pro-democracy protest, which began more than a year ago and has only grown more intense, in no small part due to rampant police brutality, arbitrary arrests, and the increasing aggression of the pro-Beijing camp. Just weeks ago, 15 pan-democratic politicians were ejected from LegCo, and pro-establishment Councillor Starry Lee was elected chairperson by pro-Beijing politicians, allowing the national anthem bill to pass, which essentially makes it illegal to disrespect the Chinese national anthem, among other things. There is a larger threat looming over Hong Kong, the national security law being drafted by Beijing, which, in the eyes of many, will bring about the end of Hong Kong as we know it. So here to discuss this and more, we have with us Wong Yik Mo, Hong Kong activist and member of Demosisto. We have Benny Tai, Hong Kong activist, legal scholar and co-founder of the Occupy Central with Love and Peace campaign, one of the major campaigns in the Yellow Umbrella movement. We also have Johan Nylander, journalist and award-winning author, Professor Torbjörn Lodén, who taught Chinese language and culture at Stockholm University, and also has a background at the Swedish Embassy in Beijing. We also have Olle Johnson, foreign policy spokesperson for the Swedish Liberal Youth League. So first off, I want to thank you all for joining us here today and taking the time. I'd like to just quickly start off with a few questions about the current movement in Hong Kong. So first, I'd like to ask you, Mo, there seems to have been a shift in the movement. It began as a protest against the extradition bill last year, and it's seen some dramatic change, seemingly prompted by the national security law. Could you just briefly describe how the movement has changed since the law's announcement, and how what it is and how it will impact Hong Kong?
Right. So from the movement, we have observed a lot of police violence, of course, and different kinds of crackdown. So whether it's from with violence or on finance, to spark alliance bank accounts, or to to threaten to dismiss people from their positions. Yet people still take to the street, and we can see only yesterday that's 1 year anniversary. And people are not afraid. But then, national security law is really, how should I say it? Splitting people to these brave and bold and those who want to play a safe card. Many people are already discussing leaving Hong Kong, to migrate maybe to Taiwan, and some politicians has just had a press con, to talk about the foreign policies in the EU, and to lobby Europe to accept Hong Kongers, whether to have citizenship or as students. I mean, that's gonna change Hong Kong tremendously, because on the one hand, of course, we need help from foreign countries, so that we are safe and not to be sent to China. But on the other hand, these arrangements are not really helping Hong Kong. And if people are really leaving, then what do we have left in Hong Kong? So I think that's the difference that we have observed after the promulgation of the national security law, especially NGOs and INGOs are starting to worry about their work, and as we all know, self-censorship in Hong Kong, especially for the press, has been a huge problem, especially in 2018, if I remember correctly. That has a little bit changed during the anti-extradition movement, because journalists they were brave and to stand up and to report the truth. But then now that the national security law has been started in the progress, then I would say journalists and people, employees in the government and in private sectors and also NGOs will start to worry. So I'll say what has been the works that has been conducted in Hong Kong, to help the freedom movement in China has been changed, and now people are thinking of moving maybe to Taiwan. So I don't know, maybe these NGOs or INGOs, maybe Amnesty International, for example, will have to move its Asian headquarters. So I think that's at least the huge impact that we have already observed.
Right, thank you for that. Now, Mo, you mentioned that people are leaving. Johan, I'd like to ask you, because it has been reported from numerous outlets, that investors and businesses are quickly leaving Hong Kong and losing faith in Hong Kong. Can you comment on the impact that the national security law will have on Hong Kong's economy?
Yeah, I mean, there's like two guillotines hanging over the head of Hong Kong. One is the national security law, and then is the potential reactions from America, right? So I don't see this as the end of Hong Kong, but it's naturally a massive change. It will be the end of Hong Kong as we know it at the moment. I think some industries will suffer tremendously. A lot of people will try to move to other countries, and others in industries will probably, benefit, right? I think Hong Kong will continue to be one of the leading financial hubs. Mainland Chinese companies will continue to come to Hong Kong to raise money, and actually even more so now, because a lot of Chinese companies, institutions, they might feel safer coming to Hong Kong with this new security law, and potentially this will be something that is even international banks will exploit, right? Because you will have more capital flow from Chinese investors coming to Hong Kong. With this said, right, there are like tremendous challenges ahead. There's like horror in the air when I speak to people. If you look at my industry, being a journalist, I think Hong Kong will definitely lose its role as Asia's main hub for media and for news companies. As Mo mentioned, I've seen a lot of self-censorship, a lot of especially younger local journalists, right? Saying that sometimes they actually lean towards self-censorship, and I've heard this since the umbrella movement, and something that might escalate now. The other major trend I see for the media industry is that several of the big international media companies, without mentioning any names, but like some of the world's leading newspapers, are planning exit strategies. How to set up new Asia regional headquarters in Tokyo, in South Korea, potentially Taiwan. So I think for the media industry, just to give you one example, it will be a tremendous change, and Hong Kong will definitely change in a very negative way in that perspective.
Right. Yes. Now, speaking of Hong Kong's future, Benny, you've been quite vocal about your thoughts on the future of Hong Kong. In the past, you've put forward the idea of Project Storm. which would see a pro-democracy majority in the district council elections, which came to fruition recently in the past year. You also formed a map of sorts in an op-ed in the Apple Daily pertaining to the future of Hong Kong. Some would say events appear to be moving much faster than you predicted. You theorize that current events will result in the dissolution of the Legislative Council. Can you expand a little bit more on where you see Hong Kong going in the next year, and if or how you feel the international community can impact this chain of events?
Now, the democracy camp in Hong Kong now is working on a campaign to win the majority in our Legislative Council. We call it 35 plus because the Legislative Council has 70 seats. So if you have the majority, that means that you have 35 seats or more. And that is our plan now. And when I wrote that article, actually the situation basically is, or the aim basically is still the same, that we want to win the majority. But the result might be a bit different because of the coming national security law. The original plan is to win the majority, and because if we can control the majority, we can in a way influence the government through adding pressure, like we may vote down the budget so as to demand for changes. And that's a chance that the Legislative Council will be dissolved by the Chief Executive under our Constitution, the basic law, if the budget is being voted down. Now, but the situation now that I think that's still a good chance that we'll be able to win the majority, but it's very likely that all these winning candidates will be disqualified by the Chinese authorities or through the Hong Kong authorities under the new national security law. We still do not see the text yet, but it's likely that that will be done. But there's still some reason for continuing the campaign, because we want to demonstrate to the whole world that how China actually damaged the autonomy of Hong Kong people. If you have an election, the groups that can win the election are all being disqualified. What clearer message to the world than this one, that the Chinese authorities is damaging Hong Kong's autonomy? I think the comments made by the President Trump and Pompeo all might be confirmed that the Hong Kong's autonomy is not there anymore.
Yes. Just a general question to you all. How, and I did sort of touch upon this with Mo, how has the movement changed on the ground? Because it must have grown a little more intense than it previously was.
Pardon? Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure. I wanted to know how the movement has changed on the ground, and if we could expand on that a little bit, because people are surely feeling more frustrated. And as much as we talk about the economy, we do have to remember that these are people fighting for their freedom.
Right. Well, the protest on the ground is getting more difficult. Just because of the coronavirus, there's a social distancing in Hong Kong, which the police definitely used it to crack down on the people. Just people walking along in the street can be collected by the police and then fine them, for a public gathering. And also, I think just yesterday, Ted Hui, a legislative councillor, he was arrested by the police again. So the protests are getting very difficult, and people don't expect any, should I use the word, we don't expect any mercy by the police, because they're losing their minds, apparently, using disproportionate violence. And so I just saw the comment, Narayan, just now that you mentioned economy. I think people are getting frustrated that Western countries are still talking about economy, and trade with China while people are shedding their blood in the street, and some even died. Friends of mine were attacked at the Lennon Wall. But I think, to be fair, foreign countries do have to concentrate on their economy, because that's their interest, right? And also in Hong Kong, we have to care about our economy for the long run. So I think talking about economy is not contradicting the movement and democracy and freedom. But I think it is important to actually connect the two topics together. And then, as we know, FTAs with China, well, there's no such FTAs yet. But when EU signs FTAs with foreign countries, there is a human rights clauses. And I think countries joining WTO, for example, there are conditions, and some of them are, of course, related to human rights. I mean, there is mechanism to protect human rights, even when we talk about economy and trade. The problem is now that China is getting too strong, and people are afraid. Member states of the EU are afraid of confronting China, and I think there is the problem. So what I am proposing when I do lobby in the EU is to make changes through economy, which I think for the long run, that's the way to save Hong Kong, so that people don't have to even protest in the street. I mean, there's not fun to protest in the street for 1 year.
Well, thank you for putting that more eloquently than I could have. Yes, of course, these issues are interconnected, and as much as we do have to remember that this is about the people of Hong Kong, we have to take all aspects into consideration, because they are all significant in their own way. Now,
could I add a note on this?
Sure, absolutely.
Just to add on what Mo said about how difficult it is to be a protester today, right? So last night I went to Mong Kok, this residential area in Hong Kong, as a journalist to cover one of the protests, and there were more police on the streets than I think I ever seen before. There were tremendous amounts of police, and I saw not one single protester. So there were a lot of angry local residents, who were shouting to the police, and the police were pushing around media, pushing around local residents, storming up and down the streets with their shield and sticks, but not one single protester. So I think for Hong Kong to raise its words, it's really hard to do it on the street, right? I think, as most mentioned, it needs new strategies and new help from Europe and elsewhere.
Yeah, I agree that the development of the protest is that we may have to use more ways to continue the protest. That actually, from a recent survey, is found that people still wants the movement to continue. I think the majority still support the movement to continue, but just that whether there will be more street actions or more confrontations, then actually that will depend on the choices of protest, because it's the risk and also the cost is now much higher. I think the infiltrating the protest spirit into the daily life might be the kind of strategy we are going to adopt. And we may talk more a little bit later about the election, that the election itself is a way to protest, as I've already mentioned, that even though our candidates might be disqualified, but with a chance to voice out their views through the election. Actually, it's a kind of de facto referendum. If we could have the election and people will indicate through their votes whether they want to continue this kind of rule in Hong Kong or not, or whether they support the national security law or not. So that's another way for continuing. In the long run, I think we will later discuss more is about the yellow economic circle. I think that's another way for continuing the struggle, how to infiltrate into the community. Also, we have mentioned about the district councillors. Actually, we have now 380 democratic camp district councillors, and they are working very hard in the community. And actually, that allow us to penetrate deep into the community. Actually, that's not the things we could do in the past. As I am now arranging the primary election for the pan-democratic camp, we need to have some polling stations all around the community. Actually, in the past, it's very difficult to find those polling stations. And now we have all the offices of the district councillors in the community. Their offices can be converted into a polling station. And that means that it's much easier now for us to coordinate the things to do in the community than in the past. So that's the way I may be a bit more optimistic about the future, though I can foresee that the road surely is rough.
Sorry, Narayan, I just want to add one point. As Benny and Johan mentioned, that we have different ways of protest. So protest is not only in the street, but I do want to mention that not only protesting in the street is dangerous. I mean, there are civil servants who want to start a referendum on the national security law, to vote it down. And Patrick Nip, one of the top officials, said that's completely unacceptable. I mean, once the national security law is introduced, it touches on 4 areas, and who knows which area they will use to frame us, as subversion or separatism, or, street protests might be framed as terrorism. And what we do now, just in a webinar to talk to Sweden, might be framed as foreign interference, conspiracy. So every front is just as dangerous. So that's the situation now. And I do agree with Benny that winning the election is very important. I mean, China might introduce its provisional legislative council just like in the past, but we don't know. We don't know what effect we will have. And the only way is to try our best to win every battle, despite the danger.
That's absolutely right. Yes. But if I might direct the conversation back to the international community, which, as you mentioned, will impact the future of Hong Kong quite a bit. Torbjörn, I'd like to ask you, broadly speaking, Europe, like much of the Western world, has historically maintained a change through trade relationship or approach to China, in the hopes that trade would eventually lead to the democratization of the country. But it's become clear that doesn't seem to be working. In fact, in recent years, we've seen the Chinese government, or the CCP, grow increasingly aggressive in its attempts to assert dominance. Even here in Sweden. Would you agree with that statement? And where do you see the Sweden-China relationship heading?
The relationship between Sweden and China is very difficult at the moment. I think as most Swedes, I think that free trade is basically a good thing. Free trade is good for the welfare of people all over the world. But there are certain situations when free trade becomes very difficult to maintain. And China's action, the actions of the government of China with regard to Hong Kong, brings us to such a situation where also a free trade promoter like myself have to consider possible economic sanctions against China. But I think if such sanctions are adopted, and again, I should say that, remind you that I'm not a politician, I'm not an economist, I'm a student of Chinese culture, so I don't really understand these things perhaps in depth. But for me, when I discuss possible sanctions, this has nothing to do with worries that sanctions might affect Sweden. But we do have many examples of sanctions internationally which have not worked. So I think if we adopt sanctions against China, economic sanctions, then we must design them in such a way that we really have good reason to believe that they will be effective. And we are later, I understand, in this webinar going to discuss the possibilities of the yellow economy and boycotting goods manufactured in China might be a possibility in a country like Sweden. I'm not sure. But my answer on this question has to be a bit vague. I think I speak for most Swedes when I say that most Swedes are skeptical of the effectiveness of economic sanctions, but under very special circumstances, such sanctions must be may be necessary.
Well, thank you for that. We will discuss that.
Maybe I don't know if I could take the time to say something about my background to offer some perspective of my views on these matters. As I said, I'm not a politician. I can only speak for myself here. I'm not an economist. I'm a student of Chinese culture. I have devoted the greater part of my professional life to studying Chinese culture and to promoting cultural and scholarly exchange with China. I went to Hong Kong for the first time in 1970 as a young student of the Chinese language. And later I've been back to Hong Kong as a visiting scholar and visiting professor. So I have some knowledge about Hong Kong. I left Hong Kong after 2 years as a professor in 2015. I've also worked as a cultural attaché in our embassy, in the Swedish embassy in Beijing. I have even been the director of a Swedish Confucius Institute for 10 years. So promoting exchange with China has been extremely important for me. And during these more than 50 years of engagement with China, I have on several occasions been disappointed. And the most terrible disappointment, of course, was June 4 in 1989, but there have also been other disappointments. On the other hand, I've also seen China opening up and becoming integrated into the world. And I've seen the standards of living rising dramatically for many Chinese people. And this is something I rejoice in. I find quite wonderful. I like to see a prosperous China. And I want to make a point to emphasize this, because I'm certainly not an enemy of China. When it comes to the special position of Hong Kong, at the time of the handover in 1997, I was quite optimistic. I was optimistic at the time of the joint declaration in 1984. I thought that the Chinese leaders, and especially Mr. Deng Xiaoping, were serious when they spoke about one country, two systems. And for the first few years, it is my impression, I don't know what my Hong Kong friends say about this, but it was my impression that it worked fairly well. But rather soon, it became too obvious that the Chinese government in Beijing was not prepared to allow the chief executive in Hong Kong to be elected in general and free elections. And of course, this annoyed many people in Hong Kong. And now we have this terrible, the adoption of this national security law, which of course outrages not only the people of Hong Kong, but people all over the world, and not least in Sweden. May I say, and I'm sure that I speak on behalf of most Swedes in this, that we feel great admiration for the courageous struggle of the democracy movement in Hong Kong, and for large sections of the population in Hong Kong to maintain Hong Kong's autonomy. This is the background of my views.
I wonder if any of our other participants would like to comment on that or add.
Yeah, I could add a comment on the whole debate on sanctions on China. I think it's, at least from a European perspective, the American perspective is always like very aggressive, right? We're going to punish you, we're going to hurt you, we're going to threaten you. I think the European way has traditionally been more to find common grounds, like as Torbjörn mentioned, is the double feelings about China. And I mean, people in China feel that they are, bullied by the West. The United States try to press them down, right? They just want to, make business, make money, and go on with their lives, right? On the other hand, China has been a member of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, for almost 20 years, and still doesn't live up to most of, the most fundamental rules, right? And the question is, like, will they ever, like, will they stop supporting the state-controlled companies? Not likely. Will they suddenly open their market totally to Western competition? Like, never, right? So how would sanctions make them lower their head and just agree to Western terms, right? I find it a very damaging way forward.
Right. I think Ole would like to add as well, if I'm not mistaken.
All right. I hope you can hear me. And I can just add some background for me as well. I'm the foreign spokesperson from the Liberal Youth. So we are the youth organization to the political party Liberalerna in Sweden. Speaking of sanctions, I think it's actually time to explore the possibilities, at least of imposing Magnitsky sanctions on human rights abusers in Hong Kong. I do believe that Sweden can, of course, not do this alone because we are a rather small country. So I think at least it could be sent a signal from the European Union that we are not okay with the developments in Hong Kong. The issue, of course, when we are asking for European action on this issue, it's that the European Union doesn't really have such a mechanism in place right now. And speaking of history, the European Union has been quite weak when it comes to taking external action to like human rights issues. But I think it's especially important here if you are to impose any kind of sanctions. I think it's very good that there is several different countries that do it together. So therefore, I think it would be important that the European Union would do it together with, for instance, United Kingdom, USA, and Australia and Canada. And just to explain a bit about Magnitsky sanctions, that is a more directed sanction towards those who can actually be found guilty of human rights abuses, and it's include like visa bans and assets freezes in the European Union. So yeah.
I'd actually like to ask you, Ole, about a similar question as I asked Torbjörn. After actions such as detaining Swedish national Gui Minhai, as I'm sure everyone's aware, threatening media outlets via the Chinese ambassador in Sweden, the Pew Research Center unsurprisingly found that 70% of Swedish people had an unfavorable opinion of China. And it appears that the threat of the Chinese government is a growing public concern, as well as the political concern. Can you comment on how this has impacted Sweden's foreign policy toward China, and how you feel about its approach thus far?
Yes, Torbjörn can probably also elaborate because he probably knows more about this than me. But I think what we have seen in Swedish politics for the past years and the past decade is that politicians is becoming a bit more aware of the security threat from China. And I think we can see policies coming from Sweden that, for instance, the investment screening policy that they want to put forward, that they want to put like investments from China that is directed towards critical infrastructure under scrutiny. I think such policy proposals is a sign that the Swedish politicians is becoming a bit more aware of the China security threat. But then also it's always this balance between values and interest. China is, I think, they are surpassing USA as a trading partner for Sweden this year. So they are an important trading partner to Sweden. And I think the government is taking that into consideration as well. But right now, I think would say in Swedish politics, it was quite interesting for a couple of weeks ago. It was a meeting in the European Union Committee in the Swedish Parliament, where a majority of the opposition voted for EU sanction, that the foreign minister should lift the issue of putting sanctions on China in the European Union. The governing party, the Social Democrats, did not support that, but a majority of because of opposition parties has a majority, they got that through. So I think it's becoming also becoming more relevant for most parties to actually lift the China issue.
I think Mo would like to comment or add to that.
Yes, just in response to all these points. First one about the Magnitsky sanction. It's actually passed. The decision has been passed by the Council of the European Union back in December last year. EEAS is drafting the provisions, and it has been delayed, very possibly because of the coronavirus. And then also, when we talk about EEAS, we are aware of the infiltration of by the Chinese in the external service. So I think we do have to put an emphasis on the Magnitsky sanctions in the EU, which the US has already. And as far as I know, well, some people are already working on it, just like people are working on different ways to put pressure on China and Hong Kong. And just a matter of fact, some other countries in the EU, actually, like Estonia or Lithuania, they do have Magnitsky Act in their own law. But Magnitsky sanction is primarily targeting Russians. And now I think it's a good idea that EU has this targeted sanction against human rights violators globally. But then I do see some problems when the law is finished and put to the council to vote. I mean, there is Hungary or Greece, or Czech Republic, who might oppose, and then that might also take many years to pass. And also, I mean, even if it's passed, even if the provision is really for global sanction and can be used against Chinese officials and Hong Kong officials, will they use it? Will they implement the laws? I mean, China violates all rules already. In the end, money talks. Are member states willing to confront China and really use the Magnitsky Act to target a sanction to sanction officials in China or in Hong Kong? I think there is a big problem. And therefore, again, I think we can talk deeper in the yellow economy in later discussion. But then to all these other points, that Sweden has passed the decision that the foreign minister has to push forward the sanction in the foreign minister meeting in the EU. I think it's such a pity that no member states echoed. What I do see problem in economic sanction, just like Torbjörn and sorry, I forgot the name. Johan, right. But I think it's very important to show a gesture to China that European states are aware of the problems about the national security law. And when the Joseph Borrell and also other foreign ministers in the EU said, like the German foreign minister Heiko Maas said that dialogue is the key to solving problems. I mean, we have had dialogue with Beijing for at least 23 years, not to mention the time before the 97 handover. I mean, what results we have? China is not someone that you can have a dialogue with. I mean, you have a dialogue and you try to solve problem through negotiation only when both sides respect rules. And China is definitely not one of those that you can negotiate with. Sorry for using this extreme example, but then, I mean, would you try to negotiate with Hitler? I wouldn't say so. You start a war, right? Well, they started a war. And I think China is actually more dangerous than Nazi Germany, than USSR. And China is actually starting a war, trade war, and also a war in Hong Kong, violating the human rights and, you know, putting 1 million of the Uyghurs in the re-education camp. I would call it just as evil, if not more evil, than other dictators in the history. So I think concrete actions like Magnitsky sanction or, you know, changing the economic model should be adopted in order to solve the problem and save Hong Kong and also save the whole world.
Well, thank you for your comments, Mo. It's we actually briefly touched upon it. The next question, if we might turn to the US for a moment. In recent weeks, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced that the State Department recommended that the US should no longer recognize Hong Kong as being autonomous from China. I wanted to ask Benny and Johan how you think this will affect Hong Kong as an international financial hub.
I want to respond to the issues on sanctions first. Actually, that's related with the situation in Hong Kong. When we talk about China, actually, I want people to make a distinction between China and the Chinese Communist Party. Actually, they're not the same. And the Chinese Communist regime is an authoritarian regime. I think the free and democratic world, up to this moment, must consider how they should continue their relationship with this authoritarian regime. And in the past few years, actually, I've published a report on the Chinese soft power. Actually, we can see that how China has used its soft power to infiltrate into the free and democratic countries, and surely into how that affects Hong Kong. And so, going back to the question about the decision that Hong Kong is no longer autonomous city or autonomous region, I think that is an approach the state has now adopted, that in dealing with an authoritarian regime, dialogue surely is preferred in any case if you are really having people with some sense there. But you are now talking with an authoritarian regime. Is it the way that you can achieve your goal? Now, so the United States has adopted, you may say, a more confrontational approach. And through that, surely Hong Kong people will be hurt. And actually, that is in some way shared by a lot of Hong Kong people now, this kind of burning together mentality, that if we want to undergo the change, or if we want to see a change, that must be a cause. And people in Hong Kong, at least some, they are prepared to pay the cost. That even if Hong Kong may not be considered as an autonomous entity, and Hong Kong may lose this special status in its relationship with the United States, now that may affect Hong Kong economically, politically, and I think even socially. But that may be a process that we have to undergo. I don't know how far that will also affect the Chinese community or the Chinese society or the Chinese regime. But I think it's something we have to face. It's something is there now, and we have to face the future. But with a different attitude that in the past we tried to avoid that, but now with the advancement of the authoritarian regime more and more, actually there's no other way out, and that's almost the only way we can see a possible change in the future.
Johan, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tremendously difficult question, because you always heard this, we burn, you burn with us. But I'm not quite sure if destroying what you love is the way to make it better. It's a very difficult thing. Like, I mean, if you look what would happen to Hong Kong if they were to revoke the special status? Well, first of all, you would have restrictions on all high tech, so it would just hurt normal people in Hong Kong. All providers of, say, broadband, mobile apps is all dependent on US technology. My broadband connection would be even worse than it is now. The rating agencies would downgrade Hong Kong. It would make life more difficult and more expensive. The stock market index MSCI would downgrade Hong Kong to emerging market, and massive amount of money would leave the city, hurting household income. It would be really hard to attract foreign talent, and I think people will just be goddamn miserable. And so, is that the price you want to pay, or are there better ways forward than to destroy the thing you love? I don't have an answer. I just have questions and a lot of doubt if this is really the best way forward.
I think Mo would like to add to that.
Sorry, just a quick response.
Sure.
I think we have used all methods that we have in order to fight for Hong Kong's democracy, and actually it's a pity that Hong Kong people is now forced to make that kind of choice. It's a difficult choice, and it's unfortunate that we have to do that. But just that, what's the other way? It's just we cannot find another way to go.
Yeah, and can I again add just a small thing? I'm just worried that, I mean, don't get me wrong, I lived here for 10 years. My son is growing up in Hong Kong. I love this city, and me and my family are here to stay. I'm just worried that this will lead to increased oppression, that Beijing and Xi Jinping will just increase the impression of oppression of people here. And it will not lead to that will make things better. Or how do you see it?
So I think that's linked with the international sanction. That's linked to the international sanction. That surely things in Hong Kong would not hurt China or the Chinese Communist regime directly. But I think it's that with the infringement of Hong Kong's autonomy and the basic rights of Hong Kong people, as I've mentioned, emphasized again and again, that the free and the democratic world will have to consider what to do about this situation. Are you going to see the 7.5 million free people in Hong Kong suffer? Now, that will be the choice of the international community. And I think Hong Kong people is now ready to put forward this situation. We suffer, we will burn. But whether we will cause any change, it is no longer to be decided by us alone. Actually, it's a matter for the whole world. If the whole world is going to see the 7.5 million people being burned and without doing anything, there's nothing we can do. So be it. But that is what we are turned to do.
Yeah.
I think I want to thank Johan for your care for Hong Kong. I think it is true that nobody wants to burn, but it's not Hong Kongers that can decide whether we want to burn. Burnism is only talks about if we burn, you burn with us. China is burning us already. We are like frogs in the warm water, cooking slowly. So we die today or maybe in 10 years. But if we die now, maybe we'll have a chance. I have to say people in Hong Kong are desperate. I wouldn't say ordinary people will say, yes, please kill me. No ordinary people would use suicide bomb if they have other ways. But in Hong Kong, the situation is really that bad. And you just can't remember how many people cry every day in the street at home, how many housewives, how many office ladies, protesting, just different people. So I think that's the last resort that we have. And somehow I think standing in the street for a very long time, it made us strong. So sometimes I do have this optimism in me. I mean, there is a saying, at least in my mother tongue, Mandarin, I grew up in Taiwan. I briefly translated into English. It's like the strong ones can beat the weak ones, and the cruel ones can beat the strong one, and the desperate one can beat everyone, because they're desperate, they become very dangerous. So I think in Hong Kong we are in this kind of situation, and I'm a little bit optimistic, because even with 1% chance, I will still try that maybe China will back off, because hurting Hong Kong's economy, it might also hurt China's economy. So that's the whole spirit about Burnism. So I think, let's see who will back off first. So I think in Hong Kong, people are already desperate. And now let's see how China will react.
I would like to focus on Sweden for a little bit, and its actions against China. Sweden has cut ties with China in some ways. For example, its Confucius Institutes were all shut down this year, and it was reported that some cities had ended their sister city agreements with Chinese cities, or are in the process of doing so. There are numerous issues that might hinder a nation from taking further action, one of the biggest being economic ties and interests, as we've already established. Torbjörn and Olle, can you explain how economically reliant Sweden is on China? And would Europe be willing to take similar action as the US, or would Sweden specifically?
I cannot with any authority explain how reliant Sweden is on China, but I can say something about public opinion in this regard. I think that the Gui Minhai case and the Beijing government's policies vis-à-vis Hong Kong have made Swedish people extremely critical of China, to the extent that probably a great majority would like to cut down on relations, to the extent that this also worries me a bit. I think that cultural exchange, scholarly exchange is important. I want to maintain that. But people who are here in Sweden are really outraged about the Chinese government. And I think you will see that this also has policy effects. I think Olle already mentioned that security has become a key word in our relations with China, and I think rightly so. I mean, this is something that I also myself come to understand rather recently, that although I think in many ways economic cooperation with China has been fine, still we must apply a security perspective to all economic relations. We cannot let Chinese interests, Chinese investors buy any company. If Chinese companies want to buy Swedish companies, we must carefully examine this from a security point of view. And this, I think, is already starting to have an impact on our relations. I think that mobile phones, for instance, I haven't checked this recently, but I would think that Chinese companies find it more difficult, don't sell as much mobile phones now that they used to do, because of the critical attitude on the part of Swedes. So what do you say, Ola? How can we explain how reliant Sweden is economically on China? And my inclination would be to say that Sweden is still a wealthy country with trading with many countries all over the world. I think we could do, we are not really reliant on China, but of course trade with China has some significance, but that should not be the decisive factor. I think we must be prepared to sacrifice some economic interests if we are convinced that this will benefit, for instance, Hong Kong. But there are also other ways of responding. One question I would like to direct at our Chinese participants here is what you think about the idea of bringing the adoption of the security law to the International Court of Justice in The Hague. Is that something that you think is important, or do you consider it rather insignificant?
Well, I'm not so sure whether that's possible. I think I'm not an expert in international law, so I'm not so sure that whether the ICJ at Hague will entertain such a case if someone with the capacity to bring the issue before the ICJ. And for example, if the British government is prepared to do so, at least British government is a signature of one of the party to sign the joint declaration. But if China refuses, and they can foresee that China will surely refuse to have the case being considered by the ICJ, then would the ICJ has a jurisdiction to rule the issue on the national security law, or whether that's a breach of the joint declaration. I have a doubt on the feasibility of that. Actually, that's a lot of legal hurdle to and surely political hurdle to overcome. Surely, if it can, I surely that would be great, because at least that will put the issue before an internationally recognized panel to decide, or to give a view on the matter.
I know Mo wants to speak, but before that, can we hear from Ole as well?
Yeah, we're going a bit back and forward on the questions here. But if perhaps Mo can start if he had any comment on the ICC, and then I can continue a bit more on the Swedish case.
All right. Just very brief. I think if Professor Benny Tai, law professor, doesn't have too much to comment, then I think I'm not in the position to add too much. I just want to to go back to Torbjörn's calling us the Chinese friends. I mean, I would rather you call us friends from Hong Kong. That's it.
May I add something here? I think it's very important to make the distinction that Benny made a short while ago between the Chinese government and the people of China. I would never call the Chinese government my friend, but I would think of the people of China, many people in China. I wouldn't think of the Chinese people. I have many friends in China, and I have many friends in Hong Kong. Don't you have friends in China?
No, I think Mo is saying that Hong Kongers now would prefer to be identified as Hong Konger rather than as Chinese friends. Surely you can call us. Yeah, you see the Hong Kong identity is now.
No, I take it.
I'm not offended.
I accept that you are my Hong Kong friends, of course.
I'm not offended. It just to make it clearer.
Right. Okay, because we are a little pressed for time, let's move on to...
I think Ola wanted to talk about the ICJ.
Right, yes. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, yes, to continue shortly on the topic of Sweden. Yes, shortly, I think a lot of Swedes certainly will change their attitude to China. There is much more criticism to China, but I think most Swedes doesn't really realize how dependent we are on China. I think Gothenburg is a quite good example. Volvo Cars is the biggest employer in the city, and they are owned by Geely, which is Chinese, and there is a sort of a balance act here where the politicians have to decide, okay, we risk losing all these job opportunities, but in the same time, we still have to stand up against China. And I think it became very, for Gothenburg, this conflict is very obvious, because Gui Minhai, the jailed author, he was living in Gothenburg, so he has a strong connection to Gothenburg. And for the city, it's sometimes difficult to take the stand for Gui Minhai, because they want to maintain the good relationship with China. However, Gothenburg did not sort of close their partnership deal with the Shanghai last month, but still the city still consider the relationship to China very important. So there is really this conflict between interest and value, and that is probably going to be a very important discussion that needs to be done both in Sweden and in Europe for the coming decades on how we should actually see our exchange between Europe and China.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, thank you for that. That's as I said, because we are running a bit long. I would like to make sure that we cover the yellow economy, which is quite an important topic when you're discussing Hong Kong, of course. Of course, the yellow economy is surnamed because of the yellow pro-democracy symbol. Now, Mo, Benny, and Johan, can you briefly explain what that is and what its impact has been within Hong Kong?
All right. Yellow economy is it's getting more complicated, but sorry, can you hear me? All right. Yellow economy started actually way back after the Alabama movement, as far as I can remember. So basically, we are supporting these so-called yellow shops. Yellow is the color of the protest. Yellow restaurants or yellow businesses that supports freedom and democracy. Well, so far we have had a lot of support in Hong Kong. People queuing up in restaurants for 1 hour or 2 hours, just to support these shops. And by doing this, we have successfully, forced some blue shops, pro-government shops, to close down already. I mean, there's a principle of economy, right? Of free trade, of supply and demand and supply. So if more people want to support businesses that will support freedom and democracy, then we have the capital circulating in our circle, and I think it's very important to bring yellow economy to the international arena, not just in Hong Kong. I mean, in the past, there are some other movements like free-range eggs, for example. It's only because people support free-range eggs so that there is such business. And it's only because people boycott animal tests in cosmetic products so that brands will stop using animal tests. I mean, it's always from bottom up. It's not the government's deciding which kind of business model should continue. It's the people who can make their decisions. When they buy products, they pay money, and all these money banknotes are just like ballots and to vote for the businesses that they want to support. So I think if we can successfully use our ballots to tell China that we don't want to support businesses like these state-owned companies to continue its oppression against Hong Kongers, against Uyghurs, or against the Tibetans. And I think we have also seen some change of minds in Europe already. Let's say the coronavirus reveals the danger of dependent on Chinese market and its raw material and supply chain for example, the face masks and all these medic products, and not to mention the security-related businesses like chips. So I think yellow economy is definitely something that we can do, feasible ways to pressure on China.
Yeah, I can just share the experience that I have last week. That I went to a yellow restaurant. There's a live band there. So as we eat, suddenly we sing the Glory to Hong Kong together. So that you can feel that is the protest spirit. That's what I say, that how the protest spirit can continue by infiltrating into the daily life. And now, like my family, we will look at the product we buy, whether it's produced in China. If yes, we will not. We'll just buy products produced outside China, like Taiwan or other places. And so that is something is starting. I think it's still at a very beginning stage, that it may be still at the consumer or the retail part. But can it move further? I think that to the whole supply chain, I think it still needs some more time. And I think that's also the yellow economy circle has a international dimension. That if I think it's for the civil society in Hong Kong or the people in Hong Kong exercising our consumer rights. Now, maybe we can connect with the governments, but if we could connect with the civil society, like in Sweden, with the consumers in Sweden, that if that's a kind of a worldwide campaign against products of China, now that is how we can cause China to burn also. If you say we burn together, then how we can cause China to be burned? If we can start a international consumer campaign against China because of China refusing to honor the promise and now constituting a threat to the free and democratic world, then at least for consumers in the free and democratic world, we should consider how we should exercise our buying power. And if we can kind of connect it and build up this international dimension of the yellow economic circle, not just Hong Kong, but the worldwide circle, then that will have an impact, maybe even bigger than the United States saying that Hong Kong does not enjoy any special status, because that will really cause harm or hurt China or the Chinese Communist regime, as you say.
All right. I just want to supplement on Benny's point. Well, I do think yellow economy is the ultimate means to win over Beijing, because that's 100% peaceful and that's democratic, but it takes a long time. I just want to comment on Benny's remarks that we want to do it as a consumer campaign, which is, of course, something that I aim for and I have been preparing already. On the other hand, I think it's also very important, not just for consumer level, but it's also to business level, B2B, from the supply chain itself. Maybe, to the raw material, we can be less dependent on China and the whole factory, the whole supply chain. If we can move the factory to somewhere else, for example, to Eastern Europe or to Southeast Asia, I mean, to have factories in China is, of course, very easy because of the because, for example, in textile industry, Chinese workers do much better than in Southeast Asia. But I think it is important to take a step forward to start making a change, because if you don't make a change today, it will never get better. By saying this, I don't mean to boycott China completely. I mean, Chinese regime is, of course, holding its people as hostage and threaten the whole world, because we don't want to hurt the 1.3 billion, 1.4 billion people. But I think it is very important to start moving the business out of China. So I think consumer level and business level, and also these two levels, and also policy level, Sweden very recently, well, I don't remember when they are going to vote for this. I remember it's end of June, to stop foreign investments in Sweden. And as I understand, it's targeting Russia and China. So if member states in Europe can also make changes in its policy, then you can definitely put much pressure on China.
Yeah, could I add here? Yeah.
Yes.
So, yes, as Benny mentioned, I have some quite fantastic memories from having a coffee or a drink in a yellow cafe, and people spontaneously start to sing "Glory to Hong Kong," and it's quite emotional experience. I think regarding the yellow economy, we might be at the early days, something that might transform into a global moment. I spoke with a friend here in Hong Kong earlier today. He's actually an analyst at a global wealth management company who said, what can you do in a capitalistic society where you have limited political influence? Well, you can always control where your money goes, right? And I have a good friend. He ran one of these yellow cafes. He said that it has actually benefited his business, and he can now feel that he can more strongly stand up for his values, right? And you have all these apps like WhatsGet, where you can find, where you can find yellow shopping. And I think this is something that most likely will spread globally. And at the moment, I don't want to, overestimate the financial impact this has on the economy. For his values, right? And do you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, can hear you.
All right. Okay. Sorry. So I don't want to overestimate at the moment the financial impact this has on the economy of Hong Kong, but it's been enough for Beijing's liaison office to say that using the yellow economy is to ignore the rules of free economy, which is kind of ironic. It just indicates that they still don't know what free economy is.
But I do agree, and I think although there is a controversy in yellow economy in Hong Kong, but then from the reaction from Beijing, from the newspaper, and from C.Y. Leung, our former chief executive, criticizing the yellow economy, I think we are going the correct direction, because we are hurting their pocket. And that is the only reason why they are reacting. Yeah,
and I think especially the more peaceful sides of the Hong Kong protests, had a lot of people across the world learn that there are peaceful way of protesting, and I think this yellow economy, when maybe Hong Kongers can teach demonstrators in America and Europe that instead of throwing bricks, you throw your wallet. Right, and that might have even greater impact.
Yes, and maybe Torbjörn and Ulla could answer. Do you think that similar consumer behavior could be adopted in Sweden?
I can begin. Yes, it's of course very difficult because we are living in a global economy, and different parts might be produced in China and some other parts might be produced in some other parts. So which products are you actually supposed to avoid? But I think because consumers in Europe, they are very aware of climate, they are very much picking products if they are sustainable or not. And I think if you can manage to brand product products that are sustainable from a democracy or human rights point of view, that might be actually a trend, that you try to actually avoid products that you know are not coming from very like that you're coming from like democratic, sustainable places. So that perhaps might happen, but still, I think most people haven't realized like how deep we are into the global economy and how dependent we are from products from China. But that might change if the perception of China continues to deteriorate. It might actually be a thing to avoid products from China, but that's a big step. And of course, it will also be very expensive for the people that have to pick products that are from other places, which then might be more expensive. But if people are willing to pay that price, yeah, perhaps that's a way to actually make an impact on China.
May I add a few things here, a few words here also? I do think that this is a very appealing idea to use yellow economy to put pressure on Beijing. It's a non-violent method. It's a democratic and very modern way. And I think that actually many Swedes would be willing to take part in such actions. I mean, they have to be organized, and to really put pressure on Beijing, this cannot be confined to one small country such as Sweden. But I think we should make an effort perhaps in this regard. I think it's a very good idea. Also, I think we should notice that as the image of the Chinese government is deteriorating, and then more and more companies are considering moving to other places than China. Manufacturing in China is no longer as secure and as favorable as it was for a long time. So I think this is something we can also see. And I would think that the leaders in Beijing are very sensitive to this kind of thing. If consumers throughout the world, or in many parts of the world, like a small country like Sweden, refuse to buy products from certain companies, I think this might have an impact.
Thank you for your insights in these issues. I think it was very, very good to hear what Sweden could do. We have briefly mentioned sister cities in Sweden. It has been suggested that establishing sister city agreements with Hong Kong will be beneficial in gaining international influence, which would, in theory, allow the district council's expansion of power, giving more democratic power to the people. So the thinking is that we should have a sister city agreement with the district councils instead of Caroline, for instance. This only works with the participation of the international community. Can you provide comment on why this will work or not, Benny?
I think it works because now the 18 district councils in Hong Kong, we have now 17 controlled by the Democratic camp. And last week, actually, the 300-something district councils met together with the 18 councils meeting together under one roof and have their own separate meetings together and pass a resolution against the national security law. And also, they have set up a new platform of some form of dialogue or coordination among the different district councils. So I think the district councils are now working towards this direction. Surely the Hong Kong SAR government would use all different ways to block the district councils from connecting with the international community, but I think it's still within their power to do so. If that's a proposal or some form, a particular district council, like for example Kwun Tong or Wong Tai Sin, those under the controlled by Democratic camp, can connect it with another city council. So because Hong Kong is a highly populated city, actually one district council, actually the population maybe almost the size of a small city in some country. So actually, we can have the 17 councils under the CREG-CAM to connect with 17 cities in different parts of the world, maybe in Sweden, and that will be some way for Hong Kong to connect with the world. I think it's possible. I can kind of talk with the district council to see whether it's possible to work.
So a follow-up question on this one is, what if we create a sister city agreement with, for instance, Gothenburg? Stockholm will not be possible since Stockholm has a policy that it will not form any sister city commitments, since it's the capital of Sweden, and as such it's already a sister city to all cities, all capital cities. But what if say that the Hong Kong government says that this is illegitimate and would like to, or hijacking that sister city agreement, so it would be their agreement instead? How can we avoid that?
That's the reason why I say that it's better to link with a city council, with a city council in Hong Kong. I mean the district council, but one of the district councils connecting not at a whole city level, but at a sub-city level, or do you understand what I mean?
Yes,
not
the municipality. Yes.
Yeah, the municipal level. Now that will be much more difficult for the government to block, because then you are now connecting with the municipal council with the district council, a particular district council, and then they can make an agreement. So it will not say that we are not representing Hong Kong. We are representing Kwun Tong or Wong Tai Sin, and linking with a municipal in Stockholm or what. And then we can build that up. Now, if like, I don't know how many municipals in Stockholm, for example, you have 17, and you have 17 district councils, and all these 17 municipals and the 17 districts have an agreement. Then it is almost like a city agreement. So it's a way to avoid the issue you mentioned, that it's Hong Kong is a city. If Stockholm wants to have a sister city, then you should make with the Hong Kong SAR government. But we are talking about a municipal level of connection. I think that will make it easier for us to build up that relationship.
Please.
Thank you, Tao. Well, I don't want to be over optimistic, so I think Benny's point of view is very interesting, and I do think that Hong Kong district councils need more exchange with foreign countries. But regarding sister cities, I don't think that's too feasible, because I think we need to see things from a legal perspective. Well, I don't know if city councils are allowed to sign sister city agreements with districts in Hong Kong. Like in, let's say, London, I just Googled it. Population is around 9 million. So, I mean, there are cities which have also higher population than Hong Kong. And for sure, there are different districts, like Berlin. There's Neukölln, there's Mitte, there's, Friedrichshain. And I don't think London will, let's say, sign sister city agreement with simply one district in Berlin. So I don't know. I mean, if that works out, if what Benny said could work out, it will be ideal. And I'm very happy to see that. But then I just don't know how possible it is for foreign countries or foreign cities to sign sister city agreements with Hong Kong, with merely one district in Hong Kong.
So my point is not a directly city. It's like in Berlin, there may be a sub area. They have also a local council. Actually, it's about local council and local council as a sister relationship. And building that up actually will be able for us in the future to move further. But just start with a local council in a particular city like London or Berlin. the local council of London, not the whole London.
Right, but just how willing are they to do it? I mean, do they even care about Hong Kong? Sorry,
I think that there is some willingness. Sorry for this, but we have actually looked into this in Sweden, and there are municipalities that would like to make these kind of agreements. So, and it's not a heavy legal document. It's like just a voice out of that we are friends, according to those we have been talking to.
Right,
and you can let me have the information, like for example the population size of that municipal, and then I can try to match with a almost equal size district council, and I can talk with the chairperson of the district council, and then we can just exchange the proposal and see whether it will work. It's possible. Yeah. I think it's always possible.
And the Swedish municipals are very small, so it might be hard to match. But,
Ole here, can I break in?
Yes, Ole. Yes, please, Ole.
I think it's also a very, very interesting idea that you put up. That would, of course, give a more official recognition to the democratic councils of Hong Kong. But I think in the case of Sweden, I think it's legally possible, as Paul brings up. These documents, they can be written quite vaguely, so it doesn't have to be like a city. But I think it's very much dependent on the politicians in that specific municipality. I'm not really sure that I can come up with like any municipality that would be that brave, because most municipalities, they don't want to have anything to do with foreign policy. But perhaps it would be possible to find like a municipality with a majority of parties that is a bit more brave in this, because of course it would send a good signal if that would be possible to do. But I'm a bit pessimistic that there actually would be municipalities in Sweden that would like to take this stand. Otherwise, I think that the best idea of is like between politicians from organizations that support the councillors in Hong Kong. That is probably the easiest way in the beginning, rather than official recognition from the municipality.
Yeah, just want to add a comment on that. Is that we have asked Täby Kommun, and they have actually shown interest. So there might be some openings. Yes, Benny, please.
Yeah, I think we just need to start with one. We do not need to have a very big project at this moment. We just start with one, and if we have the first agreement, then we can start to search around the world and reach out to the world. It's not just Sweden, but not just Stockholm, but I think it's about, we can have Berlin, London, any city, big cities in the world, and we just find one municipal or local council in that city, and then we can connect with at least with 17 municipals. That's a very clear message to send to the world. And it's a kind of a very, we may be crossing the red line after the national security law, but I think if we do it in a smart way, maybe it's still possible.
I think maybe we should send emails tonight to Gothenburg.
Yeah.
Yes, you definitely should. I just want to tell that I need to leave in 2 minutes.
Yes,
so
understandable.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, we're running out of time, and we have already we're 5 minutes over, 6 minutes over. But so if you some of the guests could stay a little bit, and I think we have still people watching us. And we have some user questions, so I will go through them here, and maybe the panel here could try to answer. And Ole, thank you. If you need to leave, of course you can do that whenever you need to. Thanks for your participation. And if anyone else has to leave, please raise your hand, and of course you also can leave at your will. So I will go through these questions now, and feel free to answer. one question here is from HOC on CG about the affected students in Hong Kong. Would Sweden take those affected HK students? Maybe Torbjörn have some insights of that.
So I did not quite understand that. To take which students?
I mean the affected Hong Kong students that has been the protesters. Since we have a new national security law in Hong Kong soon.
I see. Sorry. Let me try to say something
refugees.
About this. Yeah. I don't know, and I don't think there is any such scheme at the moment. But I do think that this is should be an important item on our agenda to work out a scheme to receive protesters from Hong Kong in Sweden, not only students but also other activists, perhaps offer asylum and of course this is a question that is not confined to Sweden, or Europe should bear some responsibility for this. I think it's very important that we should make an effort to open our doors to people from Hong Kong who want to come here. But I don't think there is any such scheme now, and I would I'd rather know that there is none.
Yes, I think there's a lot of discussions here in the chat window, but I cannot see any direct questions here. I think Raymond Chan has a couple of views, and one of the things is that when we are talking about free trade, shouldn't we think at least a bit that does improve the human rights conditions in CCP?
But I think the EU has not signed FTA with China, nor with Hong Kong. There is a BIT that has been discussed for forever, but it's been delayed. And I think it was originally put on the agenda this year, but I think it might also be delayed. As far as I know, according to the EU constitution, all the FTAs and bilateral agreements should include human rights clauses. But I wonder how strict member states are going to take these take actions for human rights violators. And that's why we need Magnitsky sanction and yellow economy.
Yes, thank you. There was a question from Don Wong here. I need to find it out again. Sorry. Here. So is there any other actions Sweden could do regarding China's latest actions, either individual, institutional, and or governmental level? Again, Torbjörn is the only Swede left in this panel. I think is Johan. Johan is here. Okay, sorry.
Yeah. Would you like to say something, Johan? If I may add a few words, I would say that we have already discussed the yellow economy and possible economic sanctions. I think the yellow economy is a very important thing, and I also think that this, what I would call an asylum scheme, to open our doors to people from Hong Kong who want to come here, is something that we should do.
Sorry, Torbjörn.
Yep.
I think asylum scheme and also accepting students and maybe grant visa will help Hong Kongers for sure. But I think for the long run, we need, for example, yellow economy and other means to help Hong Kong. But then I do agree that by accepting Hong Kong nationals to Europe, we might also put pressure on China. Let's say take the money out from Hong Kong, because China also needs the money from citizens And what if the share market drops tremendously and all the housings prices drop? So I think we should do multifaceted. So I think every means will be helpful to Hong Kong.
Would you like to add any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really difficult to know exactly what to do going forward, but maybe one of the most important things is having these kind of discussions as we are having now. We have people with different input come from different countries and see how we can find mutual grounds going forward. And I think, I don't know, it's really hard to have dialogue with Beijing, but again, as we mentioned before, it's about the party, it's about the people supporting the party. It's not about the people from China. Like I have a lot of really good friends in China, a lot of really good friends from China live here in Hong Kong, and what I'm mostly concerned about is that we see a global almost hate against everything Chinese, and it makes me a bit worried, right? I'm not worried about the trade war. I'm not worried about the Cold War. I'm worried about like a proper war. That we go into like uncharted territories where like dialogue are just breaking down, and we don't try to understand where we come from, and that the dialogue are being replaced by hate. And
I very much agree with that. So, for instance, maintaining our scholarly exchange, inviting students from mainland China also to come to Sweden, to continue to do so, although such programs must be administered perhaps through the government of China. I think such cooperation such contexts are important, as tourism is also very important.
Yes, Mo, please.
Yes, I think it's a very good point that we need to have mutual understanding. But I think the West has tried very hard already, and also Hong Kong has tried very hard to understand China already. And I think to a certain extent, we understand China fairly well. But it's Chinese students who come to Sweden, who come to the West, who come to the US and Australia on a mission, to censor the other students in foreign countries and to spread their kind of mentality everywhere. I think it's quite dangerous. And in order to have a dialogue, I think both sides need to have a fairly equal position so that we can really have a dialogue, because otherwise the Chinese will never try to listen.
Well, I want to emphasize again that we are not suggesting a kind of anti-Chinese or anti-China campaign. Actually, we are talking about an authoritarian regime that's called the Chinese Communist Party. I think that is what we are targeted against. And surely, as a Chinese myself, even though I see myself a Hong Konger and also a Chinese, I'm very much proud of my Chinese identity as well as my Hong Kong identity. Though some young people now, they don't want to be seen as a Chinese, but still, people like me at my age, I will still be very proud of my Chinese identity. So it is not really about against Chinese people or Chinese society. In a way, it's a bit paradoxical that what we are doing now is trying to help China and Chinese people. And only if China can open its door to democracy, then in the long run, Chinese people will still suffer. Even though maybe under the present rule, they may continue to, well, actually from recent data, we know that 0.6 billion people still have their income less than 1,000 renminbi. Actually, it's a very small amount of money and still surviving. Actually, so it is a pity that we have to use this kind of seem to be anti-Chinese strategy or campaign, but actually in the long run, actually we are hoping that China will be able to change through changing the nature of the regime, and that's the work we are doing in Hong Kong. At least we show to the world that Chinese people, though I must emphasize again, some Hong Kongers refuse to be considered Chinese people, but people with Chinese ethnicity, okay, I would say that the ethnic Chinese is possible to embrace this kind of values we treasure. And you can see the people in Taiwan, they are also ethnic Chinese, and still they will embrace all these values of freedom, democracy. Actually, we share the same values. We could share the same values.
Okay, I think we have one last question before we say goodbye. It's Iverson Eng. Our Swedish friends have to convince Nordic plus Baltic partners to speak up for Hong Kong. It is clear that we should not expect a common EU position on the Hong Kong questions, but Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Estland, Litauen, and Letland should be able to do a Litaua, maybe it's called in English.
Lithuania.
Lithuania, yes, thank you.
I think.
May I add one thing here? As far as I am concerned, or would you like to speak more? It's okay.
I can do after you, please.
Okay. I just wanted to say that I think it is very important that Europeans, to a greater extent than so far, speak up for Hong Kong. This is absolutely essential. But doing so, I think it's also important to make an effort to phrase our support for Hong Kong in such a way that, as far as possible, we avoid giving the people in China the impression that we are anti the Chinese people. We are, of course, hopeful that China will develop in a positive direction. Also, we are not against the Chinese people. When Hong Kong was returned to China in 1997, I hoped that after 50 years, mainland China would be much more similar to Hong Kong, that mainland China would develop in that direction. And I think that could have happened. But most unfortunately, for the past decade or so, loosely speaking, China has become more authoritarian. But this mustn't make us lose all hope. We must still stick to the hope that a positive development towards a more pluralistic system in China is also possible, and we must exert ourselves not to alienate the people of China in our support for Hong Kong. This is my
yes, Mo, please.
Right.
Thank you.
I just would like to respond to Iverson's comment. I think it is true that Swedish friends have to convince other countries, like in the Nordic or in the Baltic states, and not just within the EU, but also, let's say, Iceland or Norway. When I'm in contact with Moderate Party, and I think Moderate Party has been doing very well in helping Hong Kong. For example, pushing the foreign minister to take the lead to sanction China. And I think Sweden, well, in the foreign ministers' meeting, it's of course a pity that no other countries echoed its decision. And I think it's exactly the time that Hong Kong should show support to Sweden, because Hong Kong has been fighting for very long and we have been waiting for support. And now Sweden is willing to do something. And I think Sweden also needs some support from us. And I think I'm very thankful for those, just anyone, including Sweden, Swedish MPs and the government officials who try to make a change. So I think it's going to be tough to convince other European countries. But I think this is also very important. And we have done our jobs. We will continue to do so. And now it's your turn, European politicians' turn and European people's turn to convince your government to make a change.
Thank you, Mo. I think that will be the last sentence for from our panel. Thank you very much. I think we have already run out of time, and we are actually much over time. So thank you, Benny. Thank you, Mo. Thank you, Johan, and thank you, Torbjörn, and of course Ola as well, that has already left. So we're just coming to the last few minutes here, and once again, this has been very informative. I'll end this webinar by echoing what many others have said. This issue connects to all of us. Helping Hong Kong is in its fight helps to safeguard freedoms everywhere from the influence of the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party. Thank you all for taking the time to be here today. Stay safe, stay well, have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Everyone,
Stay
thank you
safe.
so much. Thank you.
Bye bye.
Yeah, thank you so much.
多謝晒。
拜拜。
光復香港，時代革命。
See you, Dr. Mang.
時代革命。
拜拜。